Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to February 2021 Sydney Office 365 Meetup. My name's Ken Jostling. I'm joined today by my co-facilitator, Con. How you doing, Con?
Very well, buddy. How you doing, Ken?
I'm all right, mate. We are very, very fortunate today to be joined by the venerable Matt Suckling. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Ken, and thanks, Con, for the opportunity, and hopefully we'll have an enjoyable, informative session.
So the agenda for today is we spend the first sort of 10 minutes talking about some of the new and interesting stuff in Microsoft 365. And I have to say that last week was an absolute doozy for big announcements, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. Matt's session today is going to cover information protection and Azure information protection in particular. So Matt's here today to give us a foundational overview of what's on offer within the Microsoft 365 space. I just want to quote Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella here. He says, Microsoft, or we collectively, have participated in the largest at-scale remote work experiment in the world, or the world has ever seen. I think what he's talking about is the challenges that employees and organizations face interacting in the current climate, particularly managing work-life balance. You couple that with Forrester's claims that between 60 and 73% of all data within corporations is never analyzed for insights or larger trends. You can really refer back to all the information that Office 365 is collecting about the work that we do. For example, all the My Analytics data. Typically, that is just left for dead in organizations, and beyond the odd dashboard here and there isn't really any insight organizations are getting out of that. So last Thursday, February the 4th, Microsoft announced Viva. Viva's Microsoft's hedge bet that they're going to capitalize on employee experience and employee well-being in 2021. So all the industry analysts are forecasting huge amounts of investment in employee experience systems in 2021. What Viva actually is essentially a portfolio of add-ins that sort of slot into Office apps, Outlook, Microsoft Teams, and there are 4 that they've announced. Topics, insights, learning, and connections. So these 4 things sit as essentially add-ins to your existing Office 365 or Microsoft 365 plan. I think the only one that they've actually priced at the moment is Topics, which is coming in at $5 per user per month with a 1-year commitment, and obviously that is on top of your existing license commitment. So the rest of the products are going to be gradually rolled out within 2021, and I think Microsoft has said they're going to add some more to the portfolio as time moves on. So if we look at Topics just quickly, Topics is essentially a way to group related content, people and metadata essentially. So this is one of the outputs of Project Cortex. It's kind of similar to SharePoint Syntex, but where Syntex more sort of deals with the cataloging of documents, Topics is something that you curate using, for example, initiatives, business terms, current events, and it's all AI driven. So the AI is scouring all the content, it's traversing the graph, and it's bringing relative content together. What you can then do as a user is you can manually curate that, and you can surface topics as cards in a Teams chat, for example, pages in SharePoint, or there's this whole concept of a topic center. English is the only supported language, but they're going to support Spanish, French, and German in the second half of 2021. The second tool that was announced is called Insights. Insights is really taking the My Analytics stuff to the next level. So this is a way of viewing your work-based or activity-based data, not just at the individual level, but at the group and the organization level as well. Examples of activity-based data include focus hours, the amount of hours you're spending in meetings, whether you're multitasking, things like that. It requires an Exchange online license because it's mining your calendar and your Exchange data to find out what your meetings look like and how you're interacting. Obviously, it's tapping into things like chat and Teams. But the idea here is that managers can look at team activity, and the AI-driven solution can preempt when things are looking like they're going to go south and teams are going to burn out. So as well as helping users make informed decisions about how they can adjust their day, I think they're talking about virtual commutes and focus time. It also helps managers identify and remediate areas where teams might be under the pump and not necessarily communicating that out. The third app is really just a learning hub, Viva Learning. So this is something that will surface learning-based activity, courses, training, computer-based training. It supports integration with LinkedIn, all the usual suspects, LinkedIn, Skillsoft, Coursera, etc. Microsoft have pledged support to integrate other learning providers, and obviously you can also integrate your own organization's computer-based training or learning programs as well. What it does with the AI here is it uses that activity-based data and the things you're talking about and the things you're doing to suggest training courses that might be of relevance to you. So really what we're seeing here is a lot of this stuff is actually offsetting what a corporate intranet might traditionally do or what a social network in your organization might traditionally do. And so really to wrap it all together, we have this concept of Viva connections, which I just think is one giant corporate intranet nerf. Now, typically communities and connections and things would happen on something like Yammer, and Microsoft have really swung away from all of that. I think connections is going to sort of establish itself as the forefront out of the box intranet, or the closest thing in Office 365. In fact, Jared Spatero, who's the corporate vice president for Microsoft 365, he said, think of it as a gateway to your digital workplace. Connections is going to be available on desktop, and it's currently in public preview throughout the first half of 2021. They haven't launched the mobile app yet, but that's going to come later on in the year. So expect to see these things roll into your tenant. It's literally just months away. If you have the opportunity to get on the public preview for any of this stuff, I strongly suggest you do it now. The final thing I want to talk about before I hand over to Matt is just to give something that's been sort of sitting there for a while, a bit of love. SharePoint Spaces was announced back in 2018, where AR or augmented reality based solutions were a little bit gimmicky. In fact, at that time, industry analysts had predicted that mixed reality solutions just wasn't ready yet. They said it needed time to mature. Now, what we're seeing today in 2021 is that mixed reality is making such headway in sectors such as healthcare, education, construction, and also retail. And Gartner predicts that by 2020, 100 million consumers will shop in AR online and in-store based solutions. So SharePoint Spaces was introduced back in 2018 as an AR-based solution for SharePoint Online. Didn't have much traction. Why are we mentioning it today? Well, January 20th this year, Microsoft announced that they were actually going to move it and integrate it into SharePoint Online. So where you create a new document library or a new site, for example, you can actually create a new space now. Now, a space is really the creation of a viewing platform, an immersive viewing platform, which you can view in a AR headset, or you can view using the browser. So you don't need to have cutting edge tech to be able to interact with SharePoint Spaces. You can use them just using your browser. And really what you're doing is you're constructing a scene. You can use your own image assets or your own 3D models. You can wrap them around spheres. You can create 3D models. And so you can almost create this sort of scene in which people can interact. Now, this could be your products. It could be a virtual meeting space. But I think at the moment, I think it's quite experimental. I would strongly suggest people have a look and at least check it out and understand what they as an organization could potentially do with it at this stage. I think having it integrated into SharePoint Online is really Microsoft's commitment to bring it to the forefront. It's also a recognition that now the technology, it's easy to use, so you don't need developers to build your AR-based solutions, and they also feel it's now ready for general use. So I think that speaks to the maturity of it overall. So with that out of the way, I'd like to hand over to our speaker for today, Matt Suckling, who's going to tackle that difficult conversation around how to cost effectively and efficiently protect your valuable business data. Over to you, mate.
Thank you. So yes, the ABCs of AIP, basically been in the field, the experiences I've had with larger enterprises and business verticals that require a lot of governance. This is like Fed government, financial institutions, and some mining sectors. There are some key architectural things we'll go through in this presentation, some key decision points. I have varied interests. You would probably say I'm one of the veterans of 365. I've dealt with 365 when it was BPOS, one of the first people to migrate from BPOS to Exchange 2010 on-prem to Office 365 in its infancy. Yes, I like cars. Yes, I love everything Star Wars, Lego, and games. Yes, I love golf, and obviously I love my dogs and doing dog training. So taking that collective experience of where the platform's been is where I try to drive solutions for customers that is the best fit. And probably now I'm more doing cloud native thought processes and getting rid of solving business problems in cloud native ecosystems. So information protection has some key capabilities, and Microsoft are very good at talking about the capabilities and all the buzzwords that you get in your various licensing sets. But basically, the key things that most people want is a way to label their content, have policies drive how the content's accessed, automation of workflow to automate wherever possible labeling the content. You don't want people in, like say, knowledge management going through labeling the information. And obviously you want rights management for what type of content needs to be encrypted or accessed externally with encryption. And then obviously you've got your legacy on-premise components with, well, what about my unstructured data that's sitting on file servers and file shares? And then obviously you've got your monitoring and management components that with AIP has a crossover, a little bit of Microsoft Cloud App Security and a little bit of stuff that's in Azure. And I think in the last few months, Microsoft have been slowly shifting stuff across to the 365 Cloud App Security components. For data loss prevention, this is where things get a little bit murky between AIP and DLP. Basically, data loss prevention out of the box is I've got a series of templates against various business verticals around sensitive or personal information. A lot of people think, well, that's preventing my data being lost. It's like, well, no, it's scanning for particular components or particular, what they call AI trends, like passport numbers or credit card numbers or multiples of those types of information to basically say, yes, I've found something and it will be classified X, or I need to put X protections. The DLP component out of the box, which we're most familiar with in Exchange Online and as the default, which is the older version, is mainly around preventing us in email sending out sensitive information as much as possible. Cloud App Security, which is the big thing that Microsoft have been building within 365 over the last 18 months and expanding further and further, and especially with hook-ins back to Azure Sentinel and to Azure Defender, which is the replacement security center, is basically taking the AI and analytics of how your content's accessed, doing a risk score against who's accessed the content, and that's looking at things around identity protection and device management. Then obviously you got your file management, and then obviously you got integration into third-party SIEMs or Azure Sentinel natively, and then it's obviously using that to help discover, to classify, and to label, which I'll go into a little bit further in presentation as to why. And then you've got your device management component, which is basically enabling you to work out what is a trusted device within your organization or within your ecosystem in your landscape, and what trusted devices can access. So with everything that's been going on with COVID at the moment and everyone working remotely, that traditional, I have a network boundary, is now murky. In the cloud native sense, it's all around my identity, and my device is actually my boundary in accessing my cloud services. Now to break it down, and there's going to be a bit of visuals to break it down. So obviously we've got software as a service, which could be any third-party hook-ins. I've just got some examples here, which will generally hook back to our identity plane. So identity and access plane, which is for everyone we know is Azure Active Directory. With what AIP looks at is more around AD native, Azure AD native, and looks at the identity protection components as well on top of multi-factor authentication. Then there's our bridging component where our identity starts to bridge into various other aspects of services to make that huge security plane, which is conditional access. So obviously we know conditional access is around where I can access from, where do I need to enforce MFA, where do I want MFA for certain applications, allowed on or off, how do I verify trusted devices. Now what AIP does is it's using the conditional access as the enforcement plane to basically say, hey, if I meet X criteria, I can access X data label classification. Now, once the data's label classification has been done and it's been scanned and it links back to conditional access, a lot of it's looking at the online web component. So it's like if I'm using Word Online, Excel Online within the web browser. When you start venturing into, hey, I want to start looking at my devices and my ecosystem, use the native clients or the full-blown Office apps, is where your Intune and device management comes in around what constitutes a trusted device, what constitutes a device that I'm happy to access X levels of content, and that will go into things like, can I download the file, can I print the file, can I share the file, can I email or distribute the file, meeting against my information protection policy guidelines. Now, those policy guidelines, which I'll go through a little bit later, is the key part. So I just want you to keep that in your mind at this point, because that's one of the key critical decisions that businesses need to get right up front. Now, with a lot of AIP implementations, I've basically taken the analogy that what you want to try to do is have a crawl, walk, run approach. We want to start off with what you say, an audit or a discovery, define a framework, validate the framework against our classifications, like what we see is going to be the right fit for an organization. We also don't want to be lost in the framework of dealing with a 1% or a 5% use case. What I've seen in many organizations saying, I have this 1% use case for 5 users and I'm going to do a highly complex AIP framework solution, which generally doesn't work, because the more complex the framework, the more complex your enforcement becomes. There's always an analogy in IT, keep it simple, and AIP fits into that category quite nicely. Obviously, you want to look at, on top of your data governance, is you can also extend your retention policies into your AIP labeling as well. So for example, if say I have an AIP label that could be highly classified or highly sensitive information, I can define different retention policies against that within Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, Teams, and OneDrive. The classification for the labeling is the big part, and this is where most businesses struggle with defining that classification process, and I'll run through a couple of gotchas in that a little bit later on. Then you've got data loss prevention that augments and complements your sensitivity labels, so it's using those DLP templates against certain classifications that you define. And then obviously you want to get into launch, which is basically, now I've got my framework, and now I want to start expanding my ecosystem to some of my unstructured data and start migrating it to a target or doing an analysis of that content before moving it into SharePoint Online or OneDrive. So the key outcomes or indicative outcomes, what you want to try to get is, in the crawl phase, more about assessing your on-premise data, have your framework, determine your pilot users or your business units for testing for policies, labels, and tools. So you build out that bit of that end user change and adoption as well. So you're starting to build some champions within your organization. You obviously want to get your classifications mapped to your sensitivity labels and policies. Now that could be different depending on what verticals you're in. So for example, in federal government, they will have data classifications against their protection status. But for financial sectors, they'll have slightly different classifications, say compared to organisations that don't have as much sensitivity or dealing with personal information. And then the other big thing as well is with that crawl phase, is trying to build out a communication plan of what the impacts would be to the end user, what they will see, how they'll need to operate. They may need to also go through processes of changing classifications of information as well. In the walk phase, you really want to be looking at, do I really need to deploy the full AIP agent on a workstation if I want to scan data outside of my OneDrive? So if I'm using OneDrive for folder redirection in Windows 10 as an example, and I'm pretty confident all my documents is going there, I'm just looking at OneDrive, so I probably don't need the AIP agent. But if you're saying I want to look at unstructured data or data that's on the device, you may deploy the agent to scan and see what's there. DLP policies basically is there to help you prevent data leaks, and you usually start off in test mode so you can audit and see what has been coming out of your environment, or if there is any data leaks to begin with. Then you also look at what automation or what areas in your structured data in SharePoint Online or OneDrive where you may need to have predefined auto labeling policies, like targeted policies. So for example, it could be a board team site where you say, I've got targeted policies around a certain classification, and all things that's saved in this location will be classified a certain way regardless of the content.
Matt, can I just ask a question at this stage? I'm just acutely aware that we haven't enabled the Q&A for this live meeting, so I do apologize to those streaming or receiving the stream for that. You know, the agent that you referred to, yep. When that's deployed to a device, obviously people's devices, it's a mixture of work information and personal data. Can the agent differentiate in any way?
Yes, it can. So going back to your framework, you would have a framework classification which would be personal, or what you'd say is non-business, and it will actually determine that that it's not part of the classification labeling, is part of the AI engine. But that AI engine is against the use cases of the content and how the data is being shared or consumed.
So you just risk the false positives and negatives, right?
Yeah, and that's why in the crawl and walk phase you want to go through weeding out the false positives and negatives. So generally with the AI engine, you'll probably get about 85% of it correct. The last 15% is where you're dealing with the edge cases and fine tuning your policies for your auto labeling or your sensitivity constructs. Does that answer your question?
Spot on, buddy. Thanks.
No problem. Obviously, with encryption policies, you want it in test only because you don't want to be sending out encrypted data to your business partners or providers and they can't open content initially. Then obviously you want to look at your on-premise configuration enablement and planning for that unstructured content. And then obviously the big thing in that walk phase you start looking at is your cloud app security configuration. A lot of people that I find are licensed for it, but actually haven't turned on the underpinning services or the underpinning components to actually get the best benefits out of cloud app security. And then you want to configure your monitoring policies and alerts in information mode initially to work out, well, can I simulate a data breach? Can I simulate something's been misclassified? Can I simulate what the AI engine sees should be classified in data in real time? And then when you get to run, it's more around reviewing that analytics, start doing your enforcement policies and alerting, enable DLP in enforce mode, encryption for certain classifications and enforce. Then your advanced workloads, you'd start looking at your sub-labels if required, or for particular departments or business units. And then you'd start looking at other objectives determined by analytics. So generally you'd find there'll be a couple of curveballs and analytics that will come out of how various people within your organization will work with data and content and interface with that content. So I've found that some people have gone, well, our intranet isn't really presenting the data properly in SharePoint Online to how the users are getting the data and accessing it, and they've actually augmented their presentation layers to fit to give their end users a better experience of finding data. And then you've obviously got your ongoing BAU, which is you need things around your support processes of managing when a breach occurs or a false positive, and obviously training. And then you obviously got continuous governance to make sure your frameworks and guidelines and policies still align to your organization. Generally, you'd probably do that annually. Now, an example framework is based in, this is based off the Microsoft one. You would probably have an internal public, a private, a sensitive, and highly confidential. But as you get to the right-hand side, you'll see in the sensitivity protection where DLP starts to come in. And then highly confidential, you may have Azure Information Protection label encryption for files. Now, this is just an example of showing the different capabilities of AOP and what would be the best fit. I've come across, for example, federal government where their baseline protection has encryption up front. It just comes down to that landscape. But the key takeaway of any labeling framework is you've got to have a mindset on enforcement of how that data is going to be accessed. And the biggest gotcha is a lot of people go, I want to start off as a small bite in the cherry and just do public labels initially. So what you call is parent labels. And they go, I'll just do a parent label, and then if I need to add sub labels, I'll add it later. What all organizations fail to realize is once you start introducing sub labels, your parent labels can't be used to label content. So someone has to go through the exercise of going through all the existing content to relabel it to a sub-label context, which generates overhead, generates debt, and also generates false positives and misinformation around the AI engine. So getting your labels and your sub-labeling, your parent labels and your sub-labeling is the most critical part for the organization, but a lot of organizations ignore the enforcement component. Now, what I mean by enforcement components is how it's going to be accessed. So if we take an example with the board, a set of board users, most board users do not have corporate logons within your organization. They will be given a link directly to, say, a Gmail account or a Hotmail account or whatever other email service, Telstra, Optus as an example. and they'll be given a link to the content. So under that highly confidential, you may have a sub label that basically says, if I've got people who are explicitly listed to be given a link to this content directly for this highly confidential information, they can access it, even though they're not on a trusted device and they don't have a corporate logon. The big thing as well is, this is some common gotchas as well, is selectively enable ARP for users and groups. A lot of them are going to say, I want to selectively do it for certain users. They don't understand for ARP, a lot of it's all or nothing. It's like, once I start putting my sensitivity labels and I can do certain auto labeling and policies to certain areas within SharePoint and OneDrive, but the actual ARP itself, even if I've got policies not advertised to users, it's basically, it's all there. It's an all or nothing approach. It's like, you might do a little bit of a pilot and then you got to start I've got to start turning things on very quickly. A lot of organizations overcomplicate their labels and their policies, try to keep it very simple. And the other thing as well is a lot of organizations skip the critical architectural step of traceability of their ARP policies to business requirements and use cases. So what I've found is going back to how the content's been accessed and how they want the content structured and to be searched is basically starting to build that policy construct with your enforcement, and obviously links back to the business requirements, like that example I gave with the board members of how that content's been accessed to various parts of the organization. Now, in the end user, and this comes back to your change and adoption, is once that framework's applied, the user in their native tool, so this is a Word document, will basically say, hey, here's a recommendation of a label, confidential, you can change it or dismiss it. So for example, you can see this user's got sensitivity not set, but the user's been prompted in auto labeling, and this is a client side client label saying, I expect you to use this. Now, there's two types of auto labeling, client and service, which I'll go into a little bit more detail later.
Matt, at this point, can I just ask about the business engagement around defining policy?
Yep.
Who would you typically involve in defining what you call the framework? Because on the one hand, you could have IT make the decision that say, you know, if it contains XYZ, the content, then label it like this. But what are you losing essentially by cutting out the business engagement? You know, how big a job is it to engage the business to decide what the implementation is going to look like? I know that's kind of an open question, but I think that's a challenge organizations have, right? How do we approach this?
It's a very valid question. What I find is organizations that are very mature in their knowledge management, and it's knowledge management is not only a buzzword, it's how they organize and structure their information, and some organizations also have what's called records management as well, so they fall back to retention as well. You'll find those organizations very mature in their knowledge management, how information is presented, will already have a data framework or sensitivity structure outlined. It's just you need to go down one level for the use cases around that structure. Organizations that are very immature in their knowledge management, so what you'd say highly unstructured in their information content, is a bit more of a journey to build out that structure and build out how that data is going to be secured, protected, but also you start venturing into presentation, like how that data is going to be presented even within 365 as a whole, like SharePoint workspaces up to Teams. You probably find their Teams would also be highly unstructured as well, with not a lot of governance. So it comes down to that maturity level. Someone who's a lot more mature, generally the process will be a little bit quicker because everyone's got a fair idea of the outcomes of what they're after. Organizations a little bit immature is a lot more of an education exercise of how things work, how things will look as an end state, but also linking back to challenging of how they want to work, because all those organizations are very immature, don't know how they want to operate or how they want to work or how they transform their organization to work with 365. Like, believe it or not, there are still organizations that struggle today with that. But it's getting them on that journey to work through that. And it could take for a mature organization, you're probably looking at ARP implemented fully with enforcement, probably about 6 months. an organization is a bit more immature, you're probably looking at 12 months plus, because there's a lot more change in adoption, education, and obviously change to business processes. You can see with the next screenshot put up around Outlook, you can also label your email messages. So generally in Outlook, if you had enforcement saying confidential, high confidential, can't go out externally, and I had them to fill an external address, it will say I cannot send it, and it will just go following the internal controls if I had internal people in there. But it's basically giving the prompts to the users. So a lot of the end user adoption is around what I see differently in my client and going through selecting my sensitivity labels. Now this is user driven, but in the back end you'll have auto labeling that will be your safeguard.
Just a quick question on the client there, Matt.
Yep.
Is the AIP client included in the Office build, or is it a separate thing that needs to get installed?
Great question. So the AIP client is downloaded from your AIP instance in Azure, which is once you've set up your AIP instance and linked it back to MCAS, it builds a mini installer that has a unique GUID that links it to your portal area, if that makes sense. So
the client is something that I download, but it's tied to my tenant.
It's tied to your tenant.
Pretty cool.
And what you can do is if you're using Intune, obviously it's a straight up MSI package. You can package it and then push it out directly to users.
Nice. Thank you.
Now, an administrator will see a message similar to below if a message is blocked, or a user would also see this as well. If they try to send a message externally, they'll get an email back saying, hey, this has not gone out externally, and this message is blocked due to X reasons. As part of end user adoption, what you really want to be looking at is having a SharePoint site that has your data classifications defined, your use cases for those classifications. So if you get these types of messages, you can actually direct the user to your standards. And then if obviously you want to have a process that if the user has made the same mistake again, that you obviously go through an education exercise with that user to help them along the way. The biggest beast of AIP, which is content auto labeling. Now, auto labeling, client side is using the Office applications in conjunction with the AIP agent. Service side auto labeling is basically policies that are around SharePoint Online, OneDrive, and Exchange Online. Now, the client side is basically client driven. As you saw on the previous slide showing these, we suggest you use X, Y, Z as a label. Service side is, think of service side as your catch-all. I'm using online apps, but it's a catch-all if no one's labeled anything. So generally most organizations would be using a blend of the two. They'll use the client side to say, hey, Mr. User, I'm giving you the chance to do it, but I'll have my service side as a back end to, if you're not labeling anything, I'll do it for you. The big thing for the service side is you can run in simulation mode, but there are limits. And what I mean by that is there's a limit to 10 SharePoint online sites or OneDrive sites or OneDrive personal collections. It's 10 total. It's not 10 of each, it's 10 total. In Exchange Online, you can run it in simulation mode across your entire tenant and org, but for the server-side auto labeling policies, you cannot. And I'll explain how you get around that a little bit further. Now, in the comparison for auto labeling, clients, there are limits to either side. So client side has a dependency on the application. So you have to be using Office 365 click to run. You cannot be using the VL editions or 2016 earlier. It has to be click to run because the AIP engines update in the back end have to be in sync. You can restrict by location on the service side, but you can't on the client side because the client's client driven. You can't restrict it. Sharing options, you can just restrict it on the server side, client side you can't. Recommendations, client side you can. This is where you have the blend. You want the recommendations on the client side to give the users prompts, but the server side you can't because you can't embed into the online versions of the Office apps. Simulation mode is service. Exchange attachments, checking conditions is obviously service because it's in the back end. And then app visual marking. So for the client, say for example, in an AIP policy, you can say, I want things labeled as the watermark to say sensitive. The client will do that instinctively as you save the document. Server side is email only. IRM encryption applied. If the user has a minimum usage right of export, yes. With server side, it's email only. So if you want to expand it to your clients are able to do a lot more with the Word, Excel, PowerPoint decks, etc. This is where I highly recommend a blend of client with the server side to deal with the back end larger components. And incoming mail is for encryption is server side as well. Now, key considerations for auto labeling. Basically, parent labels and labels with sub-labels shouldn't be configured to be applied automatically or recommended because they can't apply content. So what I mean by that is if I've got a parent label and then I add a sub-label, my parent labels no longer can be used. The sub-labels always override. So generally, if you're looking at your label structure and what you see in the GUI, you might have your top level, your top 5 parent labels, and you might have 1 or 2 sub-labels. Generally, rule of thumb, including sub-labels, you want probably no more than 7 policies. Then it starts getting overly complex for the end users. If parent labels are configured to be auto-applied or recommended in Office apps or selected from an auto-labeling policy, the parent label won't be applied. So as soon as you flick your policies to sub-labels, your parent labels will stop working. And automatic labeling with sub-labels will override, and parent label won't work as well. So they're the big considerations of what happens at that decision point of, do I just want a parent label or do I put my sub-labels in up front? So those first 3 key points are the big gotchas. The other thing as well is when content's manually labeled, it will override the automatic label. So for example, if I'm I'm saving to a location that says it's highly sensitive, if I've set the label to be, I don't know, open, that will override the automation. Server-side labeling policies, it's more around it's trying to get an idea of to run a policy per location to determine what content will be applied. And this is to run on demand. So server-side auto labeling is like, I've got a policy, I run it in simulation mode, it runs at once. It's that point in time it's not real time, it's just that snapshot when I run it. And this is inbuilt in AIP as well. And you're limited to those 10 SharePoint Online sites and OneDrive. The only components real-time is Exchange. That's it. Now, to get around that, to give you the greatest, richest view, is to actually use MCAS. Because MCAS, you can scan the entire tenant with file policies. You can informationally grab what's happening, so what users interacting with what, where they're saving what data from what locations. You can do all your OneDrive components up front. You can also test your alerting and simulation as well. And those file policies are also starting to build the framework for your enforcement for doing your auto labeling outside of AIP directly. So what I found in experience is MCAS is far more powerful with its file policies in conjunction with AIP to do the auto labeling than AIP itself, if that makes sense. Now, the key considerations when you're integrating with MCAS is obviously you want to make sure you've got Azure Information Protection Premium 1 as a minimum. You obviously need your Cloud App Security license to enable Cloud App Security. Obviously, you want the app connector for Office 365 enabled. The automatic classification is only supported for the file types I have here on this PowerPoint slide. And obviously, MCAS also has supports for G Suite, Dropbox, SharePoint, Online, OneDrive for Business. So if you're using any other third-party components, MCAS can integrate with that, where AIP natively with its auto labeling engine does not. So MCAS gives you a greater footprint if you've got some third party.
Actually, Matt, I did have a question here. Where does Intune fit into this? Is there any hard dependency? What can I get away with without having to do an Intune deployment? And what are the implications if I start this process off and then plan to do Intune later down the line?
Yep. So the key component of Intune is basically trusted, untrusted device. So for example, if you're using Config Manager with Cloud Management Gateway and it's hybrid joined devices or it's joined to your local AD, your conditional access policies can link to that to say, hey, it's trusted. Where it's different with Intune is Intune can actually be linked direct to an AIP policy to basically say this AIP policy, say policy 1 as an example, if I'm meeting criteria XYZ as part of conditional access, I will behave this way to accessing this file. If I'm configured another way, I will interact with that file very differently. So the common use case is I have a managed mobile phone and an unmanaged mobile phone. So it could be on a managed mobile phone, I can open the web version, I can use the Office apps that are installed by the store using my corporate identity to open it. I can potentially download it onto my phone if I really wanted to. But on an unmanaged phone, it could be restricted to I can only open it in the online web version of Word or Excel. I can't download it, I can't print it, I can't forward it, I can't do anything else with it. So that's where your Intune comes in conjunction with your conditional access policies. The key thing around licensing to get the benefits for that is obviously you can do a lot of things with EMS E3, and obviously includes Intune and your information protection P1. What ends up happening when you move up the scale set to an EMS E5 is it starts bringing in intelligent classification, encryption, and the sharing capabilities for inside and outside your org. So generally the EMS E5 includes everything in the E3, but the extra bits around sharing constructs for your conditional access around inside, outside your organization is the big thing. I've come across a lot of organizations that go, hey, I've got an EMS E3, I want to be able to do different policies for people outside my org or guests I have coming in. And it doesn't quite work nicely because there's limitations with the policies and the license sets that's available that is there. But that's purely an Azure Information Protection Premium P2 component to do that. So the first thing is, as part of your AIP journey, is working out your labels, working out your use cases. Will also loop back to licensing to go, do I have the right licenses and feature sets for how I want AIP to work to begin with? Very common conversation to have all the time. And you can also see cloud app security as part of EMS E5 as well. The key points for operational and go live readiness, and this is just a summary of everything that we've gone through is bullet point form. Obviously, build up your labels, build up classifications, build out your use cases, identify your pilot business unit as a champion for your ongoing education and life cycle of your enforcement. Obviously, you want to expand the pilot to your whole org in your crawl and walk outcomes. Once everything is completed around who's supporting it, how content's been labeled or enabled and reported on, then you start moving to run. And this is also going back to the question that you just asked before, Ken, is that's when you start looking at your conditional access and Intune policies for device access to basically say how I get in to access the content, how do I safeguard the content. So for example, if we take the board members who don't have a trusted device, who don't have a corporate logon, they may have a separate conditional access policy against their emails directly to say these people can access this directly to come in to access this content, as an example. And obviously notification alerting from MCAS. So you've got to be very, very clear on who needs to be made aware of potential data breaches. And the big thing in security is around you need a process to identify, contain, action, and escalate. That should be happening for everything in cloud security, period. And then obviously you need a process to deal with downgrading sensitivity label classification. So generally when you downgrade, MCAS will alert to say a classification's been downgraded. And you can go through an approval process as well to say, yes, I approve it being downgraded or not. So if you're fairly, those organizations fairly mature with a knowledge management team, they would generally work on, yes, we're going to allow it or not. And then obviously you've got your continuous educational process for end users to prevent accidental data breaches. That is the bulk of AIP.
I've got a question there, Matt, around, you mentioned before around on-premise, if customers or people, organizations have a lot of massive file shares, what's the sort of protection options available for them?
Yep, so with the on-prem scanner, that can basically link that back into Azure Information Protection and can have the same classification labels and components. There's extra things it requires. So things like a SQL database in the back end, because it's actually holding that content in isolation with the classifications. And there can be, with the AIP agent being deployed for every client, that will enact on what those classifications are and the rules. Obviously, because it's on a file server, your access would be more around your traditional on-prem coming in VPN components.
Matt, thank you so much. That's been a very insightful overview. I think somewhat of a deep dive as well into the challenges around holistically protecting your data. Thank you very much, everybody, and we'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.